Good morning, quilt friends. Welcome back to the Winter Wonder Sampler Sew Along. I mentioned to you that last week that I would be at the Garden of Quilts this week, so here I am standing in the visitor center. There's part of the quilt show there behind me. They're setting up the tents, and today they'll be setting up the quilts for tomorrow when all the quilts will be on display in the gardens. So I'm here teaching a few classes. I've been going to a few events. Last night we had the icebreaker dinner. Tonight is the Jenny Doan trunk show, and tomorrow night is the Meet the Maker event. And they have classes, like, I don't know, 7 or 8 classes going on in several different locations here, several different times a day. So it's a really busy place, and I'm here early in the morning, so there aren't quilters out walking the paths or anything yet. But anyways, that's what I'm up to right now. And I have pre-recorded our video for this week where we're going to be making the tree section of our quilt. So I'm excited to share this technique with you because this is a fun one to teach and a fun one to learn. So stay tuned for the next upcoming videos on making those tree units, and we'll see you back next week where I'll be back home in the studio. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Winter Wonder Sew Along, where this week we are going to be making some fun little tree blocks. So this is always something that's fun for me to teach because there's a lot to learn. First of all, in cutting your pieces, then in aligning them so that you get the proper alignment of your pieces so that you have a 1/4 of an inch beyond your points and things like that. So hopefully you will enjoy learning about this technique as much as I like teaching it. So what we're going to do first is you need to have your fabrics. You need some background fabric and you need some green for your trees. Then you're going to need to figure out which way you're going to be cutting the pieces for your trees. So there is a template in the pattern. Now, because this is a booklet style pattern, the template is partially on one page and partially on this page. So you can trace over it. You're not going to be able to cut it out per se. So if you'd rather not trace it and make your own template that way, you can also email me, heather@ankastreasures.com, and I can send you a PDF of this template from the pattern, and then you can print it out. Just make sure you print it at 100%, no scaling. And then after you print it out, you're going to want to test that by taking a standard ruler and measuring to make sure that it is the 7.5 inches tall that it is supposed to be. So if you do that, then you can cut out around your template just very carefully with your rotary cutter. Just like this. I'm using a rotary cutter that I have that's especially for paper, but it's just a lot more accurate than cutting with the scissor. And you just want to make sure you don't trim any of that little blue line off, that you're trimming just right on top of it. So that's what our template is going to look like, and I'm going to show you how to use this paper template, but I also want to talk to you a little bit about using an acrylic template. So this was fashioned after an acrylic template that I came out with quite a few years ago. It is now out of print. We're not doing them anymore, but a lot of people have this in their stash. So if you have that, you can go ahead and use this instead of the paper method. Either one's going to work. You can also go to your stash and see if you by chance have any other rulers, like say this Creative Grids 45-degree kaleidoscope and Dresden plate ruler. That's the same angle. It's a little bit taller, but that doesn't matter. It would cut the same angle for you and it'll work for this. So maybe head to your stash and see if you have that, because this is going to be easier to cut with than the paper template. But I'm still going to show you both methods so that you're prepared. But just to go over the angles, this top angle is 45 degrees and the bottom angles are 67.5. So not that you need to exactly know that. You can always just hold it up to your paper template, and if it matches that, then you're good. But I just want to point out that it's not a 60-degree triangle. A lot of rulers use the 60-degree angle, and that's not what we're going for. So for your cutting, if you're going to use the acrylic template, it's just very easy. You can take one of your green scraps and you can look at the lines on the ruler. Here's like 5 inches, 5.5, 6, 6.5. And we're going to be cutting 3 different sizes of trees. We're going to cut 5.5 inch tall, 6.5 inch, and 7.5 inch. So you're just going to lay whatever size you're going to cut along the bottom of your piece. So if I wanted, for example, a 5-inch triangle, I'm just going to put that 5-inch piece along the bottom. Then I'm going to grab my small 28mm rotary cutter and I'm going to trim around the ruler like so. And again, this little ruler just helps you be able to see to trim really accurately around that skinny little point up there. Now, if you're using the paper template, what you're going to want to do is take some double stick tape and you're going to put it on the back side of your paper so you can hear it's sticky now. And then you can put the paper template down on your fabric. And I'm lining again just this 5-inch line up with the bottom edge of my fabric. Now I can't see through that like I can with the acrylic template, so you're going to want to make sure that's a nice straight cut so that you can trust that that's right. Then you're going to lay your ruler on top of your paper template, and then you're going to make those same cuts that we did before. The key is don't trim anything off the paper template. You are cutting as close to it as you possibly can. Now the double stick tape is going to hold it in place for you. And then pull that away, and there you have your nice little tree template. So you can see it's not bad not having an acrylic template as long as you use this method where you lay a ruler on top of the paper for when you're trimming. So you're going to go ahead and cut out 4 of the little trees like so, and then you're going to cut out 2 of the 6.5-inch tall and 2 of the 7.5-inch tall. Then we need to cut our background pieces. So that is these little half triangles that go on either side. And so what I've given you is a cut size for rectangles that we're going to start out with to cut those, and you're going to want to lay 2 of them right sides or wrong sides together. In this case I'm laying them wrong sides together, and get those perfectly lined up on all 4 edges. And the reason we have you laying them 2 pieces wrong sides together is we need a reverse of each size. So then what you're going to do is take your template, or you can still use this, and you're going to lay it down on your rectangle, and you're going to line up the 5.5-inch line here. For example, if you're doing the small tree, which I am, and you're going to lay the outside dashed line. So I'm going to bring this up closer to the camera. You can see I'm not lining the middle line up because that does not allow for a seam allowance on there. So you have to slide it over and go 1/4 of an inch past that solid line. So again, that adds your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Does that make sense? If you don't do that, your pieces are going to be too small. Then you can go ahead and trim just like that. And then if you have a rotating mat, this is where it comes in handy. Then you can lay this on the other side and again line up those lines, and it should also line up here. And then you're going to make another cut, and there's going to be an itty bitty scrap in the middle. You can discard that. And then when you open this up, you get 2 and you automatically get your reverse. So that's why I have you positioning them the way that I do. So there's all your background pieces. And you'll go ahead and repeat that for the larger tree pieces. You know, there are sizes in your pattern that tell you what size to cut all of those. Then we're going to start talking about the sewing. So here's our little green tree. Oops, I need to grab this one. That was the 5-inch one that I was demoing with, so that's why it looked too small. So here's a 5.5-inch tall and a 5.5-inch tall background piece, and we're going to figure out how to sew these pieces together. So you can follow step by step through the instructions in your pattern, and what that shows you to do is you're going to lay these right sides together, and we're going to sew along this line. Now the trick is figuring out where to line this up, because we don't have the nice tidy little corners that we normally have. We have these little funny angles happening here. So I think the easiest way to teach people how to begin to understand how to do those angles is to first of all draw your 1/4 inch seam line on the back side of that white block. Now it's really important here that your 1/4 inch be really accurate. If you're using a pen or a pencil with a wide tip, you're not going to get an accurate 1/4 inch seam line. This is that friction pen that I keep talking about. It's got a really nice fine tip so you can draw accurately, and you can always lay your ruler down on top and you can see that's an accurate 1/4 inch. It's not been bumped further out or further in with having the wrong size tip on your pen. So here's what we're looking for. So do you see how once I drew that line on there, I can see exactly where my seam line is going to meet the green fabric. So there's a teeny tiny little valley in there, the valley being, I'm going to point to it with my pen, the valley being the bottom of the intersection between the white and the green. But you can just easily see, now that I've marked that line, that that's where it needs to go. And the same thing is going to happen on the other side. It's just a super teeny tiny little piece there that you can just barely see on camera. But that's how you're going to line up your piece. And after you sew it, you can flip it like this and you'll get a nice, where's my other tree? You'll get a nice connected piece like so. I'm going to go ahead and sew it and then I'll come back so you can see it after it's been sewn. But one thing I also want to mention when you're sewing is make sure, because this is all bias along here, that you don't stretch and pull when you're sewing. And I think the main way that that's going to happen is as you start sewing, if you clamp onto this bottom piece and pull as you're sewing, you're going to have a lot of distortion happening. So just gently guide it through the machine as you sew that seam. So I'll be back in a second with that sewn together. So I have that triangle sewn on here, and what we're going to do now is we're going to set that seam by running the iron over it. So now it lays nice and flat and kind of sinks those stitches down into the fabric. Then you're going to take just the outside edge of your iron and you're going to carefully press that seam toward the cream. So you do have to be really careful with the pressing here because this edge is still all bias here. So if you just take the iron and swipe across like this, that is going to stretch out this angle and it's going to cause the tip of your tree to curve off to the side that you're ironing. So just be really careful with that as you're working on doing this pressing. So there you can see my tip meets nicely at the top, and then along the bottom what you're looking for is about 1/8 of an inch past that point there. And I'll show you why we have that 1/8 of an inch down there. You know, typically we're used to seeing the angle coming directly off in the corner, but because of this angle being a little bit different than a 90, it's a 45, then when you take, for example, this black line that I have drawn here is supposed to be for your seam allowance. So if you sew this way along there and sew this way along there, you can see that they both still intersect right on the seam line where we want it to be. But because of the difference in the angle, it looks a little different in the bottom corner. But that gets all covered up with your seams, and you don't need to worry too much about that looking funny as long as you have that 1/8 of an inch down there past that point. So now we're going to go ahead and sew our next piece on the other side. So that's this one here. I've gone ahead and I've drawn my line just like I showed you before. It's a little bit faint here, so let me just make sure that you can see this on camera. So I'll just darken that tip a little bit. And if this is distracting to you, you can trim this piece off from behind like that. So then again, you're going to look for, see if we can get the camera to pick it up, you're going to look for that seam allowance being in the bottom of that valley. So you can see if I were to shift it up like this, you can see it's nowhere near the valley. And if you were to sew it like that, when you open it up, you would get a totally jagged edge along the top of your block like that. So that is not what we're looking for. And if you were to line it up down here, once you sew it and flip it over, it would end up being short and jagged the other direction. So it's really important to get those lined up so that you have your 1/4 inch seam line lined up perfectly with the edge of that white right there in the bottom of the valley. And the same thing on the other side here. Do you see how that automatically, let's get it right under the camera, that seam, 1/4 inch seam line ends up right in the bottom of the valley here. So again, I'll go ahead and point to that with my pen. Get the camera to focus. Where do I have to hold it? Right there. So that's the bottom of the valley right there, and it lines up with your 1/4 inch drawn line. Now, as you get better at this technique, you'll be able to learn to eyeball that, and you won't even need to mark the 1/4 inch seam line for you to be able to tell where the valleys are. But when you're first starting out, it's just something I recommend to make it easier and take some of the guesswork out of it. So you can go ahead and sew that side of your tree, and when you're done, it's going to look like this. This is that bigger example I was showing you here. But what you're looking for is 1/4 of an inch from this edge down to the top of your point. If it's more or less, then you're not getting your seam allowance accurate and you're not getting your pieces lined up. If it's jaggedy, so like one piece is higher or lower than the other, then you're not doing the valley quite right. So those are a couple things to look for and practice. You may even want to do a few blocks on some practice fabric first, just to make sure you get the technique down. But that's what you're looking for. And the pattern is going to give you a proof size for that piece. So that's your next step to double check. You're going to lay your ruler down on top and make sure that in all directions, that it is the size specified in the pattern. So once you get that largest tree done, then you can go on to the medium-sized tree and the smallest size tree, and that's all shown in your pattern. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew some of these pieces together into sections. So there's a list of all the pieces you need to cut from the background to go around your trees, and also in the cutting instructions there are sizes for the trunks. They're 1.5 inches wide and a couple different lengths. So one thing I want to point out as you're sewing some of those sections together, on that littlest tree, when you make this little trunk unit, it turns out 1/8 of an inch too big. So you're going to have to trim a little bit off of each side. It's roughly 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch overall on width, and then it's going to fit the tree and this bottom piece. So as you're working on that, just make sure that you know and take time to do that trimming on that so that that turns out correctly. And so you have the small tree here at the bottom and you have a small tree here at the top. So you're going to have to do that on all the trunk units for the small tree. So right now I'm going to go lay out all the little sections that we're going to sew together, and I'll be back to show you how that works. So once you have your tree tops sewn together, then we're ready to cut out all the background pieces that go around it. Those are listed in your pattern and they're labeled in the diagrams, A, B, C, D, etc. for where they go. So once you get those cut, then you can start assembling into sections. So here's your small tree at the top. There's a piece on either side. Then you're going to take this truck unit and sew a piece on either side, then connect to here. Then you'll be able to add this seam here. You're going to do the same with this, where you sew this trunk unit together, add this piece, then you can sew this seam, and then down here at the bottom, same thing here. And then with this one, remember, this is the little trunk unit where you have to trim 1/16 of an inch off either side before you can attach this one and then sew this seam. And then you can go ahead and sew these 3 sections together, and then on one of the units you can sew all 4 of them together. But we do need this one separated to get the quilt together later. So just keep that in mind when you're sewing. And on the one that you sew them all together, it should measure 10.5 by 27 inches. So this looks funny right now, but once you get that seam sewn, that'll fit. And that's all we have for this week for making your trees. Hope you enjoyed making and sewing with those fun angles. And I'll be back next week and we will make our scarf units.